So, a big welcome and thank you, Jo, for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to very quickly, for those people who don't know me, my name's Tom. I am the co-president of the Australian Science Communicators. I'm tuning in from Ngunnawal land, which is also known as Canberra. Jo, I'm not sure actually where in Australia you're tuning in from.
Melbourne.
Melbourne, which is Gadigal? Am I getting myself mixed up?
Koori country. Wurundjeri. Yep.
Fantastic. So we are here to talk Eureka Prizes. Last week we saw the Prime Minister's Prizes for Science shared, which I had the privilege of representing the Australian Science Communicators at that event. We did mention this a little bit in the first attempt of doing Toby Walsh's equivalent chat to what we're doing today with Jo. Unfortunately, we had some tech issues with Toby's connection, and so we're going to try and reschedule that in the coming week or so. We will definitely update you when we get to that one. But a big shout out to all of the prize winners at the PM's prizes last week. We are here, of course, talking about the Eurekas, and the Australian Museum describes the Eurekas as the country's most comprehensive national science awards, honouring excellence across the areas of research, innovation, leadership, science engagement, and school science. We at the Australian Science Communicators are clearly very interested in the science engagement sector, and that, as far as what's available at the Eurekas at the moment, includes citizen science, scientists who are increasing public understanding of science, and that's what Toby won, the promoting inclusion in science, and the Science Journalism Prize, which is what we're here to talk about today. These awards are presented every year, and they're typically done in partnership with large national organisations, government organisations, scientific institutions, and so on and so forth. They hope to raise the profile of science and science engagement in the community by celebrating outstanding achievement. So, Jo, your long-form essay, Buried Treasure, followed the most ambitious Australian Antarctic endeavour in a generation. The award-winning journalist, yourself, tracked the story for over a decade before pitching your article, which was then published in the Griffith Review in edition 77 on the 2nd of August in 2022.
Just dug it out then, that one.
There you go. Fantastic. You're doing better than me. I don't have a hard copy of it. You are, of course, a journalist, author, editor, and educator. In 2017, you also joined the University of Melbourne Centre for Advancing Journalism, where you're engaged as a senior lecturer and often referred to as a professional expert for various matters. The fact that you're hanging out at the university doesn't stop you from continuing to write, and we know that you're widely published in publications from The Monthly, The Guardian, Griffith Review, but you spend a lot of time at The Age, is my understanding. Yeah. So, a big hello and congratulations and welcome to the Australian Science Communicators. We are talking about your prize. How did it feel? What was it like to win the Eureka Prize for science journalism?
Well, thanks, Tom, for all of that. And yes, just confirming, I am very lucky and inspired to be working on the land of the Wurundjeri, and you know, their storytellers are the ultimate storytellers, and so I can only sort of hope to ever vaguely emulate the length and the duration of their wisdom in the stories I try and write. Yeah, winning it was pretty sweet, I have to say. I mean, you know, we all know that, you know, awards don't matter till we win them. And then and we also know that it's a pretty random, you know, process, and I've been nominated a couple of times in this same award, and so I sort of, you know, third time lucky this time, I guess. I did actually win it as an editor for way back in 2002, and I remember I developed then a project, the genome journey, which was, it was just as the genome was, you know, becoming everywhere, and sort of a sexy topic for scientific discussion. And so I still remember pitching as a youngish medical reporter that we needed to do a deep dive into what the genome is and was and might be, and recruited all these reporters to write on it, and submitted a joint entry which won for the Age a long time ago. So it's been a long while between drinks in the Eurekas. And the two, I just mentioned the two previous ones that were nominated. There was one I did with the ABC's background briefing about the drug-resistant tuberculosis epidemic in Papua New Guinea that had been shortlisted, and then another one that I did that was commissioned by UNDARC in the US, and then it ended up being co-published with The Atlantic, and that was around I went to northern Nigeria for that one to do a story about the efforts to the last push to try and get rid of wild polio virus. And it was kind of interesting and prescient now looking back about how these terrorists, Boko Haram, have been trying to resist the efforts to vaccinate these last areas, and enlisting all sorts of anti-vaccination, tropes and disinformation and misinformation, and it was really spooky to see how many of the kind of things that they were pushing out at the time we then saw writ large across the world through COVID. And yet, when I was doing the Nigeria story, it just seemed so bizarre that anyone would think that these conspiracies might be driving a vaccination program. But anyway, so both health medical related stories in those instances. And this one, so I'm trying to remember, were you asking about the story or about the award? But yes, it's lovely to win an award. And I think, but, particularly I think the Eurekas, it was just lovely to be sitting there with Mikey Slezak, who was one of the other nominees, Bianca Nogrady, who is just, is the founder of the Science Journalism Association of Australia, and just, a phenomenal science journalist and science communicator.
And former vice president of the ASC as well.
Right. Okay. And Wendy Carlisle, who'd been my co-nominee for the ABC piece a few years ago. There was just, it just felt so, it felt like a group endeavour, and a bit of a group love-in, and very supportive. And I guess that's one of the great things that's come out of, the Science Journalism Association, is to kind of build a bit of a bonhomie and a spirit, a esprit de corps amongst us, so that we look after one another and respect and honour each other's work. And it really did feel like that.
Yeah, I think associations have that real power of being able to create community, and it's definitely something that we've been trying to re-stir up over at the Science Communicators, is that sense of community and that togetherness that you get from that. I am interested in, and I do want to talk a little bit more about your broader work just briefly soon. But before I move on from this specific prize, because the idea of awards is something that we're thinking quite a lot about in the ASC at the moment. You mentioned they're great when you win them, but clearly there needs to be quite a bit of perseverance for you to be able to go. I had a look at your professional page, and there is that long list of highly commended and finalists, which is they are awards in themselves to be shortlisted. It's definitely, and I think, you've already mentioned 2016 and 2018 you were finalists with this Eureka Journalism Prize. Do you think that there is actually, well, clearly you do value awards, but what kind of doors do awards open for people in the journalism space, in a science communication space?
I actually think one of the most important and useful things that it does is to remind our editors and publishers of the value of what we do. And, editors, publishers, bosses, commissioning editors, they want to win awards too, and they want the kudos that comes with that. And I think when you get awards around the caliber of the Eurekas, or the the Walkleys or the Quills or the the SJAA, it's now, the awards it's giving, grants, etc., to support particular projects. I think they help remind our editors that they want a piece of that action, and they need to give us space and time to produce the quality of report that might give them a bit of that gloss, and I think, particularly in the last couple of years, we've been reminded through COVID of the importance of really high quality, thoughtful, deep, reflective, informed, accurate scientific communication, scientific journalism. They're not always the same thing. And I think, certainly awards help concentrate the minds of our bosses to give us scope to do this. So to me, being nominated, being shortlisted, that's really useful. As I said, winning it is kind of the gloss on top, but to be able to get that bit of traction, of attention, to then be able to use that to, win a commission or win more time, or, persuade editors to make room to support journalists to become specialists in these areas, and not always to have them adrift as generalists, which means that, if you get thrown onto the occasional scientific story, you're never going to develop the confidence and the networks and, the idea is to really grow and mature as a writer, as a reporter, and to produce extraordinary, useful stories. I mean, you mentioned this particular one, this Antarctic story. I mean, it did draw on well over a decade of connecting to a particular community of scientists and kind of growing knowledge, growing the confidence of them to sort of, and also to have this very, the piece is a very entwined piece. It's about science, but it's also trying to put science into a much broader landscape of context. And you can't do that if you've got a week, and you can't do it if you've got, even probably a month. It's about having the scope to be a specialist over the long haul. So I do think that, one of the key values of an award is persuading the power, the gatekeepers, to give us the room and the space. But also certainly it's very handy when I'm particularly pitching cold into the wider world. And I certainly noticed when I left the Age and started freelancing, and in my mind, as a long, someone who'd been at the Age for over 20 years, and I'd won some awards and I had recognition in Australia, when I started pitching overseas in 2012 to American and European editors, and they'd say, well, who do you work for? And you'd say, the Age, the Good Weekend, and, it's a really, credible, honourable, important Australian publication, and they'd Google it, and the Age they were looking at online is very different to the one and so to be able to build my credentials, I actually needed those awards and those lists, and that's why I kind of push them out and kind of scrupulously maintain them, because it is a way of persuading editors who are unfamiliar with your work that you might be worth a minute to have a look at the pitch.
Yeah, and I know that definitely applies across other sectors as well. In my short stint in PR land, having an award is worth the next 5 clients, because being able to demonstrate that you got runners up in some sort of campaign or whatever. So that's really interesting to hear, and really, really cool to hear that those similar kind of ideas around awards is really valuable. You did mention earlier that the two previous runners-up that you got for the Eurekas were both health stories, and that this one was really it's a climate story but connected to a broader context. You seem to gravitate towards climate stories and social justice or like social good stories. What drives that for you? Is that something that is just a personal passion of yours, or is it something that you found that was a gap at the Age at the time when you were establishing yourself, or what drove that for you?
A bit of both in different ways. I think from the time that my interest in reporting right from the beginning as a very young reporter was that I've always been interested in what we would now call, public interest journalism. And I don't think I really thought of it as that at the time, but I guess, I was always interested in telling stories that about equity and about justice and about, the basic things about the rights, human rights, how we live, what we're entitled to have, and I guess the stories of others who who may be, to get an insight into lives that where they require medical support, human rights support, resources, education. I've always gravitated to those kinds of stories. I'm not sure whether that's the long tail of 13 years of enforced Catholic education or something, I don't know. But, there's certainly there was always a sense of mission to want to do those sorts of stories. And often I felt pretty frustrated and pissed off at being dispatched on stories that I didn't think were deserving of time and effort. I do, I joke that I do recall at the age in early November most years I would hide in the toilets for fear of being assigned to write colour on the Melbourne Cup. I just really didn't want to do those stories. So if you want to write, worthy stories, and I was often accused by editors of this, sort of this terrible propensity, you have to carve out opportunity. You have to actually fight really hard to get opportunity to do it, to get time to do it. And I guess I was, a lot of the time that I was a senior reporter and working on these and trying to sort of get better and doing more meaty stories in this area, it was the time the digital disruption was biting us and we just didn't have the resources, and there was a frantic panic that we had to get eyeballs, and the only way to get eyeballs, that Kylie's ass would get eyeballs, but my stories about maternal deaths would never get eyeballs, so you're always trying to fight that fight going, it's just a matter of the quality of effort and presentation. And I'm sure if we tell the right stories the right way, we can get eyeballs, So I did work really hard to get those opportunities. I think coming out of, I'd worked as a health reporter quite early on at the Age, and it was through the period when HIV and AIDS was really just kind of, there was this mad effort to try and figure out what it was and how it spread, and public health campaigns around stopping it. And I loved the scope of stories that were available to tell, everything from kind of, the health bureaucracy and the politics of health through to the patient stories and patient advocacy and human intimate experience. And then being in these sort of, laboratories that were set up at Fairfield back in the day when there was the infectious diseases hospital was there in Melbourne, and people madly trying to figure out what were they dealing with here, and I just love that range of stories that was always available. And that's what introduced me, I guess, to the world of, peer-reviewed science and trying to find your way as a non-scientist through the literature and to determine how to get ahead of a story and develop networks of people, so that you could kind of know when a big paper was coming out and have that kind of backstory ready to go. So that kind of excitement around that sort of storytelling and that interest also then putting it within often these stories then within the framework of human rights and development issues, crises of drought and famine. You often had diseases occur where you have an emergency situation, and so you get this collision of science, medicine, public health, development, politics. So all these things start to get entwined. But the climate angle, and these will come together hopefully in a minute, but the climate angle was, I was a senior writer at a time when the climate wars were clearly ramping up, And so I'm talking here about, this sort of the early 2000s or thereabouts. And we at The Age had a fantastic climate or science reporter, Adam Morton, and he's still a fantastic science reporter these days for The Guardian and a climate specialist. In that time, a lot of his time was about the politics of climate policy, and there was also, we saw this ramping up of disinformation and misinformation trying to push back against climate policy and climate reforms and, carbon. I don't want to say carbon tax because it wasn't, but, all of this was going on. And you could see that a lot of that, the traction that was being gained pushing back against climate policy, effective climate policy, was being built on the basis of a kind of ignorance around how science worked and a knowledge of, how it worked. So you would sort of see people, how can they possibly know what the temperature was 800,000 years ago? Well, they can tell from ice cores, and so that's what kind of got me going, thinking there's all this busy important work being done around the policy front, but so where is the opportunity to tell stories about how science works? And I saw a real value in that kind of adventure story of scientific endeavour, of who's doing it and how are they doing it, and how does it work, and the kind of blood, sweat and tears of those stories, of the the backstory, because people might be lured into that and find out about how science works, and that hopefully might inoculate them against some of the bullshittery that was being propagated, so probably gloriously kind of, rose-colored glasses to think that would work, but that was kind of what I set out to do. But anyway, the upshot was that I had developed this kind of two areas of subspecialty as a senior writer at The Age, when you write on all sorts of things, but my two happy places were either development, public health, or climate science and how it worked and how it was done. And then I guess since I left The Age in 2012, and I've continued to try and pursue stories in those areas as a freelance, but then I've kind of realized that they crossed over and they're entirely entwined. And now climate justice is climate science, it's also public health, and it's development. And so the beauty of being, kind of old and having done it all is that you do see these connections in a way that, I wouldn't have seen 20 years ago. And again, that's the privilege of being able to kind of stick with something for the long haul.
And that's something that you're really able to do in that freelance space that you don't think you would have been able to do if you were still writing for The Age, for instance?
Well, actually, when I left The Age in 2012, it was in that, in a period of kind of peak upheaval. I was one of many people that took redundancies at that stage because they were just losing so many people. There'd been a lot of kind of mistakes made by senior managers along the way about how to manage the disruption and how to respond to it. And I did have the feeling at that time that I wanted to stick with longer form stories, and I wanted to write stories that were not necessarily Kylie's ass sexy. I wanted to stick with the kind of storytelling I'd done in the past. I didn't think I was going to get a lot of opportunities to do that in the way that the paper at that stage was shaping up. And so I did sort of figure, okay, I've got enough years in my back pocket to get a reasonable payout, and maybe that will keep me afloat long enough to see if I can make this work. And so I did sort of basically take my redundancy and reinvest it into a freelance career, probably as a business plan, not very smart. And because the stories I wanted to write were, they take a long time to research. They take a lot of money to get on the road. And if I was in the US and had access to some of the big, the Pulitzer money and some of this other public money that's around, it might have worked better. But in our corner of the world, there's so few publications. There's just if you get 2 stories in the monthly a year, or where do you go after that to get someone that would pay you to work for 4 or 5 weeks on a story? I was lucky that background briefing at the time would take me on for 6 weeks at a time to work on a story. That was luxury. Like, nobody else would actually pay you for 6 weeks as a freelancer to work on a story. So, it wasn't really the smartest business plan, but I guess I did cross-subsidize. Like, I'd do quicker turnaround, sort of stuff that would, the kind of commercial end of, I've got to get these stories done, and then I'd use that to cross-subsidize my indulgent stories of, going to Papua New Guinea and working on things. And then I'd also sort of developed a kind of model of intensive reporting, where if I do get on a plane and go to PNG, which was where I'd kind of become a bit of a serial parachute reporter, I would make sure that I always had 6 stories to work on. And then even if 2 of them fell over, out of a 2 or 3 week field trip, I would come back with enough to generate half a dozen stories, and that they kind of cross-subsidize one another. And that model, it kind of worked. But, I have to say, I did that for 5 or 6 years. I did the reporting that I'm probably proudest of in my career, that was the most interesting, the most rewarding. And I pretty well went broke doing it. And I do remember I won Freelance of the Year, I think, for the Walkleys. And shortly afterwards, I went to do my accounting, and my accountant just looked at me and said, "What are you doing?" So I then took the job at the University of Melbourne, which it's been useful and lucky, and because it's also allowed another phase of reflective development as a journalist and a reporter. And it's also, my position, they want me to continue to produce public interest journalism as well as my lecturing. So instead of doing traditional research in the off season, I go and do public interest journalism in the off season, hopefully. So that's why I've been able to keep doing 2 or 3 stories a year, including the one that the Antarctic one was sort of a non-traditional research output, for want of a better way, very unsexy way to put it, but that's the lingo of academia.edu.
Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed. And I mean, this does kind of address one of the questions I was going to ask around balancing between the corporate Kylie's ass story, I think is how you've been referring to it, versus something like Antarctic ice cores, because clearly I'm able to write a whole lot more celebrity gossip to the minute with a short form article that will get a lot, almost guaranteed eyeballs, and therefore a lot of ad revenue for an employer or a contractor. That whereas the long form stuff, the audiences might be a little bit harder to reach. Do you think that a somewhat hybrid university backing to support this other more valuable social interest journalism that doesn't get the same kind of reputation, or because there isn't the financial ad revenue that comes in from these kinds of stories? Do you think that is a mechanism for us in Australia, or what kind of thing do we need to do?
Yeah, well, it has been for me, but I know that there's not a lot of positions like that, and so, and it was fun. I just went to a conference, the Global Investigative Journalism Conference in Sweden, in Gothenburg, and I ran into 1 or 2 other journalism educators that do this, and we kind of clung to each other because we don't know too many others that do it. I ran into one woman from the University of Maryland who's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, also teaches their investigative and science programs, so very sort of similar thing. And then her off season, she writes long form pieces for Reuters. But it's interesting. She said there is quite a bit of those kinds of positions that you can now get tenure in the United States with that kind of model of practice-based reporting and research, but there's not a lot of it. But what was also interesting was that I ran into there were people at that conference from European and American philanthropic funds who have money to throw at investigative journalism, including environmental and scientific and health journalism. But as soon as I said which part of the world I was from, their eyes glazed over. They have money for journalism that's published in Europe and for journalism that's published in the US. But even though I'm telling them, hey, the Pacific's where all the action is, it's a geopolitical hotspot. There's all sorts of shit going down here. And there's huge environmental stories. There's obviously massive climate stories. It's going to be the front line of climate justice. But the only way I or anybody else in the Australian landscape is going to get a piece of that pie is if we can collaborate or build networks that will ensure that our stories are also going to be published in those jurisdictions. And at the moment, the problem in our part of the world is that the landscape, as I said, there's not a lot of publications that take longer form science stories. Those that do not have very much budget. And there isn't the philanthropic enterprise that's evolved in Europe and the US to support the storytelling. So we're really in a very difficult position in terms of that kind of infrastructure. And one of the things I brought back from that conference is a determination, collaboration, I think, is going to be really important to telling these complex scientific stories about what's happening to forests and where the next coronavirus is going to come from, and the economy of EV vehicles and all these other things that are going to be very front of mind. And they're really complex stories. They can't be done by one or two freelancers, or even in Australia, one or two reporters who are being hit up for 4 or 5 other stories a week by their editors. So we need to look at how we create a bloody great spreadsheet and all be working together. And that might also mean that we can harness some of these pots of money that exist in other parts of the world. And I think if we started to tell our editors and publishers about those opportunities, we might start to get a bit more traction. The other thing I saw there that I thought was really interesting and I want to think more about is just how aggressively they also think about how to get the stories out when they're published, so that they don't, I've written so many worthy stories that then sink without trace. They might get admired by, other writers or people in the field or the scientists who are interested, but the public traction is so low. And one of the really interesting stories that I saw presented at Gothenburg was about the collagen industry in Brazil and kind of the dirty secrets behind the logging and corporate enterprises behind that, including big names like Nestle, good old favourites, keep on keeping on. But there was a 10-month investigation into that story that produced lots of long-form important work that probably no one would have seen, except that they then produced it all as an Instagram-style video, influencer-style video, exposing, featuring people like Jennifer Aniston, who's the face of collagen and Nestle's program. And when that went out in the world as part of a very careful campaign to sort of sell this story, all hell broke loose. And suddenly Nestle's backing off and going, oh, well, we're changing our practices, and it hit the ground. And I didn't know whether to be depressed or excited about this, because 10 months of work, but in the end it's the 3-minute influencer style video that got the story out into the world. But then when I was talking to the people that did it, they said it's part of a very careful campaign to make sure that when the big weighty journalism lands, there is a really thoughtful campaign in place to make sure it's not wasted, that 10 months. And I thought that was something that we don't do here, and I know sites like I've had stories on The Guardian and The Age, and excuse me, if they don't get a few clicks to start, they don't back them and keep them there and push them, just pull them off, and so where's you got to back your journalism.
It's interesting because what you're just saying here feels as though there's a lot of parallels to research scientists who might feel that they've spent the last 3 years, 6 years working on a project, and they finally get their paper in Nature. And it's then summarized in a tweet by their institute or something along those lines. And so the idea of there being almost a field of journalism PR seemed to jump at me as just what you're saying now, where we are thinking a little bit more that media is evolving. It has been since we're still in a disruption. The social media boom definitely happened. We're definitely changing our behavior on social a lot, and none of the platforms really know what's going on at the minute. And so the thorough engagement with media and journalism is not what it used to be. Getting a front page story doesn't mean you get front page worth of eyeballs. It's around how much of an integrated aspect of engaging with a story or something that's important to be told. So that's actually something that I hadn't heard of, this concept of effectively, perhaps not great terms, but effectively PR for journalistic stories.
And I admit I hadn't really either. And but on this particular panel, which was all about sort of environmental investigative journalism, and one of the woman that had run that story and had done all of the legwork, she said, right from the beginning they were talking about how do they make sure that when it hits big time, and so there's a whole kind of enterprise around that. And I think the sense I got is that it's the work that they were doing, some of that's coming from the Pulitzer Center money. And I think the Pulitzer Center, in its wisdom, it's saying, okay, well, if we're providing money to do this kind of journalism around the world, we want to make sure that we get bang for our buck, in that we want to make sure that the stories that we finance don't vanish without trace. And so they've now thrown resources into that. But I'll see if I can find, I've got a copy somewhere of the Instagram video. I'll send it to you in case you want to share it with me.
Because what I'll do is I'll throw that into the link when we share this video. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
I am aware of time, so I am just going to quickly flag for those couple of people who are online with us live that if there were any particular questions you'd like me to touch on with Jo, just throw them into the chat, and we'll see whether or not we can get to them. Something that I did feel as though kind of flows on from what we were just talking about, Jo, is where does the research evidence base start to play a role here? From a science communication perspective, I'm personally very interested in concepts around misinformation and disinformation, and the pathways that it gets, that it's easier to perpetrate inside a community. Simple words to avoid, which then create images because we associate them, for instance. And that kind of information isn't available to me without there being the researchers at the universities who are doing the analysis of saying, as soon as you put the polar bear on an ice, as soon as you put a polar bear on a piece of ice in the middle of the water, people automatically turn off if they're already disengaged with climate change. And that's something like 80% of those people who you would want to reach with those kind of stories. As soon as you use that image, you can't reach them anymore. And that's really, really valuable research for me if I'm trying to get across a particular message around that. I'm wondering whether or not there's anything that comes to your mind or you're aware of as areas of research, of priority research that would be particularly useful for the kind of journalism that you're doing at the moment. Clearly, you're doing a lot of research into the actual development of the story, but what things would you like to be able to reach into your toolkit to be able to pull out and be able to say, I'm going to be able to engage in this way or not?
Do you mean in terms of research about how people receive and interpret information?
Yeah.
Well, I guess, and that was one of the things I got interested in when I was doing, when I was still at the age and, sort of banging on all those climate science stories. And I wrote a book called Feeling the Heat that was sort of a collection of came out of, it built on the journalism I'd done in Antarctica and other places up in the rainforests, and sort of trying to do, you know, ice and hot and cold, wet and dry. But, you know, I was aware that often, you know, I was singing to the choir and not getting much in the way of sort of, you know, traction. I'm thinking, well, you know, what's the point of this? So I did find at that time I went on another kind of journey of trying to get information about how to be a better storyteller. And so I went to places like the Yale Climate, what do they call this? They've got a laboratory that specializes in, you know, in researching how stories, you know, which stories get traction, which don't, you know, how do people absorb information? And, you know, a lot of it is the stuff we know intuitively as journalists. You know, you've got to find a human story, you've got to find a human angle, you've got to bring a lived experience into it, you've got to kind of lure people into something, but, you know, to the extent that they don't understand it's good for them until they've eaten half of it, you know. So so I did go looking for that kind of Yale style information about what could I do better, you know, and how do I, because, you know, I've been telling these stories for all these years, and look where we are. Like, you know, clearly it's done fuck all, you know. So so, you know, that might be overstating my capacity to do anything, but yeah, if we're going to tell the stories and we're going to get on a plane and add to the problem, we have to know that we've done our best to find ways to land them. And so I did try and talk to specialists about, you know, how to frame stories in effective ways. And I had long conversations at the time with I'm trying to think of his name now, but he's you know, climate scientist. He was the head of CSIRO's atmospheric division.
David Crowley?
No, before him. Gosh, I'm having a senior moment. But I'd interviewed him. He'd gone on Four Corners and kind of blown the whistle about some political pressure on CSIRO back in the day. And he'd also had quite a personal kind of, he'd slipped in, he talked about falling into depression because he was a scientist, and he thought if we just tell everyone what the problems are, there'll be a solution. And so then he also, an atmospheric scientist, went down this path at Monash of trying to figure out, well, what's the information about how to do a better job of telling this story? Isn't it terrible? I can't think of his name. It'll come to me.
We'll add it in the comments as well.
I'll add it to the comments, yeah. Sorry, I'll stop thinking about it because I'll just sit here looking blankly into the screen. But so yes, if you're talking about and the last couple of years, I've gone down a slightly different but related path of, you know, trying to think about how to decolonize my journalism, you know, and being aware of, you know, I've presumed I can tell stories from other people's places. Is that a legitimate thing to do? And if I am going to do it, how do I do it better? And that is related also to the climate and science stories, in that I'm often telling stories about health and public health, and you can't tell a story about, you know, a disease or, you know, even maternal deaths in a particular area if you don't pull back the lens to look at all sorts of history, and colonialism and extraction are part of that history. And it's sort of too easy to go in and just say, oh, look at this terrible thing that's occurring here. And in some ways it looks like, well, why do these people allow, you know, why does this system allow, why does this government allow these things to happen? And that's not the full story. So, and of course, you know, I might only have an 800 word, you know, word count, but I need to try and find some space somewhere in that word count to at least signal that the bigger picture here, because otherwise I've devalued and misrepresented the reality of those stories. So, I think there was an example. I did some stories in Congo years ago, and about HIV, TB, and women sort of trapped in these sort of sex work enterprise because they had no choice other than that, and then how they were kind of managing the risks of HIV and TB. But when I look back at those stories, which were written around, I think, 2007, 2008, I'm kind of embarrassed because they don't include in them enough reference to the colonial history that shaped those realities, even though I was aware of it. And funnily, looking back at the conversations I had with doctors and specialists at the time, they didn't talk about it either. I'd say, where's this problem come from and how do you address it? And nobody talked about King Leopold's ghost, and yet it's entirely, it shapes the story in so many ways. So I guess I've sort of been, when you talk about research and how, as a practitioner, where do I go looking for resources, that's something I'm kind of continuing to look for those resources, and to think about how I can use the research of specialists to not just inform the writing, but the practice of it.
Yeah.
Approach.
And I think this is, I mean, the comment that you just made around thinking about the social context behind any story is really important. I think it applies directly to science as a whole in general. And if you look at the International Science Council, for instance, they specifically include social sciences as being part of what science is, what they represent. And I think that we are shifting a little bit. Hopefully, it's my hope that we are, at least, that we're shifting a little bit more to consider some of the social context behind anything that we start to go to. We're not pushing out a response to the climate crisis without there being a social lens of what the impact is on people that are involved here. We're not just trying to solve an electricity to the grid problem, we're also trying to deal with the fact that renters can't put solar panels on their roofs. And this is, without this more full picture, it is definitely a wicked problem that you can't really solve. So it's really good to hear that this is something that is being discussed, at least in international journalism circles. That's really cool to hear.
And I mean, just quickly, like the Antarctic story, the one that won the prize, it represents some of these things in the sense that there is a story that's been written and could be written and has been written about this group of scientists who are going into the center of Antarctica to try and pull out a really old ice core and the science of that, and that's true and whatever, but it's true and it isn't, because why are they going there? Well, you could just say, because we need to know and the science is being allowed there. Well, they're going there partly also because Antarctica is a geopolitical kind of seismic shitstorm waiting to happen, and there's all these geopolitics around that, and so they get, has that team got the money to do this great big thing? Because politicians have been persuaded that they're not Australia's claim on the ice is not going to be enduring unless it's being seen to do stuff. So if I'm going to tell that story, I need to say, okay, I've got to put the climate science within the reality of the politics, which is politics always shapes science. So let's call that out. And then also, let's also bring in some of the cultural and these sort of ideas about humanity, daring do and adventure, and who does, and humanity in extremity, and how we behave and what our ambitions are. They're all texture that is part of that reality. They're hard to weave together, and, you don't always get it right. But I think, trying to kind of build as much texture into every story, whether that's social or historic or political, is entirely appropriate when, and to kind of be thinking about opportunities to do that is something that I, bang on to my students about all the time.
Fantastic. I do have one question about your students, which I'll do very, very quickly in a second. I do know that Sarah in the chat's just asked about how you got to write Christine Nixon's book. So if you've got a short answer to that.
That was more an accident. So I'd done a book I'd done the Feeling the Heat, and I'd done that for Melbourne University Press when Louise Adler was the commissioning editor there, publisher there. And I think she saw that book was one of those, all those worthy ones that, went nowhere, but, we do it because we do it. But then I think she had signed up Christine Nixon to write her memoir, and they wanted a ghost. And I'd just done this other project, and out of the blue, and I'd never met Christine, Louise said, I really think you two, you could be the right writing partner on this. And in the end, it ended up being a partnership rather than sort of a straight ghosting effort. So that was kind of completely out of the blue, because I hadn't been a policing specialist. And that book is actually more about management, really, and human resources in lots of ways. So I found it really interesting. And it was done at a very interesting time, as lots of people might know, when, I basically wrote the book one way, and then the fires happened, and Christine emerged the other side as a different person. So we kind of had to, rethink the book, and she had to rethink her story. And so that was really interesting.
I'm very aware of time, and I don't want to hold you up. So there is only one last question that I'll leave you on, which is what your view of the future of science journalism is, and journalism in Australia. You're seeing a bunch of students come through at the university where you're teaching. Are you aspirational for our future? Are you despairing? How do you feel about the journalism practice in Australia into the future?
Look, it's tough, but I've just the same Antarctic story, the story that the gift that keeps on giving, it's just been shortlisted for the Braggs. But one of the other the New South Wales Bragg Prize for Science Journalism, one of the others on the shortlist is a former student, Amalia Hart, for a piece that she wrote for Cosmos. So to sort of be sitting in that shortlist with the next generation, and I'm fancying that I've told Amalia, no matter, she does have an undergraduate from Oxford that might have had something to do with her success, but I'm going to continue to claim it regardless. I've got another former student, Petra Stock, who's working full-time for Cosmos now, amazing, younger, up-and-coming early career talent. It's interesting. We've got I've seen a lot of really good science potential talent coming up through the program that I teach in. And certainly I'm always selling them on, environment and climate and health stories and how fabulous it is. But there's a lot of interest there. We bring Liam Mannix in to talk to them about, how that works in a newsroom, and how you can work as a specialist, in a daily enterprise to try and do that work. And there've been times when I've been quite depressed about the prospects for specialisation in science reporting. But, someone like Liam has helped to restore that in his newsroom through his own, his capacity, his energy. He's sort of staked out and made the case that we need to be able to do this well, and rebuilt a team that had kind of been eroded back when I left, and made the case for that kind of specialisation. So, everything in media continues obviously to be disrupted and problematic at so many levels, but, force of effort and capacity, and hopefully increasing maybe philanthropic interest in supporting these things, because, the lessons keep coming in that we need better stories told in these areas, and that's not a random thing, and we can't expect journalists, newsroom reporters to do that work. So, depends what day it is. Am I optimistic? Sometimes.
And with that, thank you so very much, Jo. I really appreciate your time today, coming and having a chat with us. Congratulations once again on the Eureka win. It is definitely something to be very proud of, and we're very, very grateful for your time. Just very briefly, for all of us ASC people, I'm going to quickly promo that we are going to try and get Toby Walsh back on for a session in the coming couple of days, or a week or so. So please keep an eye on our channels, because that's where we'll share that. We, of course, had our careers night tomorrow night for anyone who was interested. And this might be something that's of interest to you, Jo. In fact, actually, on the 21st of November, we are holding the second of our annual Honours and Postgraduates Research Symposium, Student Research Symposium, where we're bringing together researchers who've been doing, at least about 9 months worth of research work into a key issue in science communication or behaviour change or science journalism, what have you, across Australia or New Zealand, and we're putting them all together into a symposium. So if you have any students or you know anyone who should put their hand up, then please throw them to the Australian Science Communicators webpage. But if you don't, come along anyway on the 21st of November and have a listen to some of our upcoming researchers.
Great. And Graham Pearman is the name I couldn't remember anyway.
Graham Pearman.
Yes. So anyway, look him up. He's been an extraordinarily important person in the Australian climate science story.
With that, thank you, everyone. I will end the recording now. And just a big thank you again, Jo, for your time today.
A great chat. Thanks, Tom.